Yeah, this is the thing, Jess, that is frightening. Yeah.
But did Phil and other veterans die as a result of the nuclear tests? 2 studies carried out by the National Radiological Protection Board were inconclusive. The board could not find any evidence of a link, but could not rule it out either. They did find a slightly higher incidence of leukemia, but dismissed it as a chance finding. Despite criticism, they stick by their results.
We feel that our reports are very robust indeed, and that they don't show any evidence of either life-shortening or an increased risk of cancer of radiogenic origin. But what we do feel, on the other hand, because this public concern has arisen from the court action, that it would be wise to continue the follow-up and to re-examine the data at a future date. And that is why we believe, on balance, that it would be preferable to conduct an additional study to allay some of that human concern. In fact, really, to do it on humanitarian grounds.
But there are no plans for a third study. In fact, the Ministry of Defence had decided to destroy the database until public pressure forced a U-turn. The veterans are now pinning their hopes on new research about to be published. It's being done by Sue Roff, a sociologist working at the Centre for Medical Education at Dundee University. Over the last 4 months, she's examined the death certificates of around 500 members of the Test Veterans Association.
The death certificate study is a very standard way of beginning to look at a group of people, even with the known deficiencies. That's what we've been trying to look at here, is to take a baseline reading of the death certificates that are available to understand if there is anything particular or peculiar about this group of men that requires further investigation.
Roff's study reveals that the average age of death for the veterans in her group was 56, more than 20 years younger than would be expected. Looking at the rate of death, her theory is that the veterans are contracting cancer 20 years too early, in the critical 50 to 65 age group.
Despite it being a relatively small sample, the findings are so strong and so compatible and consistent within themselves with what we know about cancer and what we're learning about cancer as a long-term effect of radiation, that it's signaling different work that has to be done on this group of men in order to support them in their health, but also in the broader questions of cancer research.
The research also shows that 2/3 of the men she had death certificates for died from some form of cancer, 2.5 times the national average. But it was the types of cancers that caused surprise.
We found, in fact, pretty well exactly the same list of 15 cancers that the United States government has acknowledged are potentially radiogenic. Cancers can be caused by any number of things, and radiation is one of them. But for men who are known or assumed to have been exposed to radiation, there's a typical list of cancers in different parts of the body which seem to be disproportionately caused by exposure to radiation. And lo and behold, we found that the cancers that the men were dying of in this particular group pretty well matched those 15 cancers.
The leukemia rate was cause for concern as well, 3 times what would be expected, a finding that caused raised eyebrows in the scientific community.
Leukemia is the one disease which is probably almost like a marker for radiation exposure. She has identified an excess leukemia, and that would tend to match what was apparent in certainly the early years of the analysis of the NRPB study.
Critics of Sue Roff's study point out that around 20,000 men witnessed Britain's nuclear tests, but she has only around 500 death certificates, and it could be that mainly sick veterans joined the association.
I think the difficulty with her research is that she's dealing with a very small number of people, and they are to some extent self-selected. What she needs to do is have access to a larger database with good controls so that there is no suspicion of self-selection.
Her research does seem to show, though, that there are 18 out of 311 people who died from leukemia, and that is I think 3 times the general population. Doesn't that show that there is a problem there?
It demonstrates amongst that group, yes, but what we don't know is how well they are represented against the general public. And so as the distribution of her cases is a little difficult to understand from what she's written.
The NRPB, of course, may just dismiss your study, say it's not scientific.
I think that it would be very unscientific of them to do that. Also dishonourable. I think the burden of proof now has to be on the government. That a group of men were dragooned, to use a very specific word, dragooned into participation in those tests, and now they claim themselves to be very ill. I think that requires looking into at the human clinical level, not just at the simple statistical artificial level. There is a great urgency that this matter should be addressed immediately because we're losing so many men, and if my study is right in its anticipations, we'll be losing them at a greatly accelerated rate in the next 5 to 10 years.
Many of the veterans feel they were used and then dumped by the British Army, and the islanders feel the same way. All over the island, tons of rusting machinery was abandoned by the army when they left. Having the island used as a rubbish dump is bad enough, they say, but they believe the tests have affected some of them physically as well. No study's ever been done of the islanders, but they tell how people died from strange illnesses after the nuclear tests. Tonga 4 was there at the time. Both Ken and Phil worked with him. Since then, he's had to watch his 20-year-old granddaughter die of leukemia. He believes the army completely ignored the safety of the local people.
They didn't tell us anything at all what's happening, but we thought in afterwards, they looking after themselves probably, but we, our wives and the children, they didn't think of us. We can feel the blast of the bomb, the heat of the bomb to our body, but nothing had been coming after to find out if anything happened to ourselves, to our body. Nothing at all. We're just keeping on working, working and happy, but we didn't know what is inside us.
Christmas Island has one very primitive hospital with one very overworked doctor. The lack of medical expertise means proper death records aren't kept. People just die and there's no way of knowing whether their deaths are related to the nuclear tests. On the day we spoke to Dr. Eritani Kamati, he'd been up all night delivering a baby without any running water. Over the years, he's become used to the islanders' concern about the effects of the tests.
Those people who were present at the time, who are still here now, whenever they have any disease, they would refer back to the test and say, could this be the effect of our exposure to the test then? But most of the time I would say to reassure them, not to make them worry about what's happening, I would say no. And that just a doctor-patient relationship to keep their minds at peace. But at the back of my mind, I would say could be.
But their health is also threatened by a toxic dump, as Ken and Jess find out. A mountain of bitumen barrels stretching as far as the eye can see. It was originally used for building roads, but it's been left to rot, contaminating the land and the water system.
I feel quite ashamed today to see what's actually happened here. If a person back home can get fined £50 for dropping litter,
exactly.
How can governments possibly get away with this sort of criminal behaviour in other people's territories? I just don't understand it.
Well, I think the first thing that should be done really by the British government is to send out some of the powers that be to come out and see this devastation. That's exactly what it is. I feel quite angry standing here and seeing all this. I think of the people here, to we're left with this. What a legacy.
I couldn't agree more with you.
Absolutely dreadful.
It's not only the veterans who are demanding action. The Kiribati government has asked the British to come and clear up the mess they left behind. So far, there's been no response.
I believe that the British government have an obligation to come and clean up the place and do whatever is necessary to put right what they have done to our environment. After all, they were responsible for what they have left behind on the island, and I feel that they do have a big obligation to provide assistance.
8,000 miles apart, the Christmas Islanders and the British test veterans are united in their demand for justice from the British government. After 40 years, it's time, both groups say, for apology and action. As the last preparations for next month's court hearing in Strasbourg are made, the final fallout from the Christmas Island tests is yet to come.
I would consider it to be one of the worst mass violations of a peacetime government since the Second World War, done knowingly that it could cause massive damage to subsequent generations and to the servicemen long term. If the cases are successful, the British government will have to pass a specific act to provide compensation to all veterans and their children. And it can be done under specific legislation. Otherwise, it would be unmanageable to cope with multiplicity of actions against the government.
It's Ken and Jess's last day on the island. They go to lay a plaque in Phil's memory at the local church.
The minister told me that this plaque would hang there forevermore. And for those who don't know anything about the time the soldiers were on the island, I hope that in some way they'll learn about it and understand why we have been here this week.
Obviously, we want to see justice for the veterans and widows, but with my sincere wish to see justice also for the people of Christmas Island.